poverty is the biggest enemy that you can ever talk about in a society. So any disaster that happens, the first impact is towards the common man's life. The disaster, when it happens, it takes the oldest and the youngest as the two easy soft targets. Good morning and welcome to the third session of disaster management. We have been speaking about this topic in terms of the various impacts that have been caused by a disaster. We have also been talking about the social impacts, the psychological and the health impacts altogether. In today's session, we are going to talk about the differential impacts of disaster management. So just moving forward, what are the differential impacts that you are going to see because of the disaster management? We're going to talk about caste and creed. This has got nothing to do with the politics or with any other factors, but then purely relating to the disaster management factor, gender, age, location, and disability. Now, when you look at all these factors might look personal to you. These factors might look controversial to you, but then these factors will have an impact because of a disaster that happens in your city, that happens in your village, or happens in any other remote corner of this country. So, we are going to just have a deep dive session in terms of understanding what is going to happen when disaster management or when a disaster happens altogether and the impact that is going to vary accordingly. So moving forward, let's start with caste and creed. India is a country which is known for its differences in terms of caste, creed and religion. Now, when I use these words, I use it very, very cautiously because I am not intending or I am not trying to create any sort of differences, any sort of judgmental values here. I'm only trying to use these values or words very, very clearly because of the factor that even on a disaster, there is some impact on these factors. Now, what are those impacts? What are those factors altogether? The one thing that you are going to see here is that people who are below the poverty line, people who work as wage workers, people who struggle for their livelihood are the most severely affected people in terms of a disaster management. Why is that? Because these people are living or inhabited in low-lying areas, which means they are very, very close to the coastal areas, or they might be living in such areas where the water inflow can be immediate. So when you look into cities like Chennai, for example, you have a lot of areas called as the slum areas, which are very, very closely located towards the sea. Now, most of the people have an occupation of fishermen, or they work as wage laborers, or they work as contract laborers, trying to do some work to make their living. Now, in that case, in that condition, if you start looking at them, they are people who are struggling a lot, first of all, to make their livelihood, first of all, to build up their entire system. On the top of it, when a disaster happens, let's say a tsunami or an earthquake or a whirlwind, whatever that happens, these are the people who are going to get first affected. They will not have a place to go away. They don't live in concrete houses. They don't live in well-established gated communities. So automatically, they don't have a place to escape and they become the easy targets for any disaster that just comes across them. The second factor, the housing condition of these people. As I was telling you, if you look at the housing condition, those thatched huts, those poor houses which are not well built in condition. Now, the government has always been struggling, debating and trying to come up in the upliftment of poor. But unfortunately, we have not yet reached a permanent solution for them. The reason for that is again due to the internal politics or the factors that have been going around. But then for these people, the housing condition is extremely bad. Now, when we go back to the year December 2005, when the tsunami struck over the Chennai city and hundreds of people were killed during that time, during that particular incident, if you remember, in the coastal area of Tamil Nadu, starting from Chennai to Kanyakumari, the people who got affected were none other than those who were living right near to the sea, were none other than those poor fishermen who were struggling for their life. The reason is that even if they would have tried to escape and go inside their house for safety, the houses are not that secured enough for their safety. The houses would have been just washed away by the tsunami waves, by that harsh waves which came at around 800 meters above the sea level. So which means to say that the housing condition of these people are not protective enough for anybody to stay secured. The next thing, the poverty conditions. Now, when you are rich enough, the first thing that you would do is try to protect yourself. But when you are poor enough, you will not be able to protect yourself nor your family. So poverty is the biggest enemy that you can ever talk about in a society. But unfortunately, disaster does not look into rich and poor. And when it comes upon the poor people, it comes 10 times even more bigger. It comes 10 times even more harder. So that is where the poverty conditions will also matter. For the poor people, since they don't have enough amenities, they don't have enough infrastructural facilities, they do not have enough shelter to protect themselves, they are the first people to get affected in this entire attack. So automatically, the poverty conditions at that time will definitely rise up. So when you look into a disaster, the aftermath effect of a disaster is even more crucial, is even more critical, because that will again aggravate the poverty line up the area. The next one, lack of information about the disaster. Now, information is actually free. It's actually available everywhere. That's what is the saying that goes in the market. That's what is the saying that goes in the society. But let's try to understand this factor. Information is not available for everyone at every time. Information comes with a cost. Information has got a price altogether. And that price cannot be paid by everybody. Why? Because if you want to get the right information at the right time, you need to pay for it. And most of the people in India do not have money even for the day-to-day living altogether. Where will they go and pay the price for an information? Why I'm trying to tell you this, why I'm trying to explain you on this factor is that way back in 2008 and 2009, when there was an earthquake, when there was a cyclone factor that happened in Haiti, in a place in the Western Islands altogether, those poor people did not have the enough information because they were not well educated. They didn't have enough satellite networks. They didn't have enough ideologies of internet or anything that could keep them informed about the situation that was going around. So automatically, when that particular disaster struck there, more than 3,000 people lost their life and more than 30,000 people were displaced out of their normal life. Now what happens here is that had somebody told them, had somebody guided them, had somebody made them prepare to face a disaster in a life, probably those 3,000 lives could have been saved. So the cost of information always comes at a very, very big hand altogether. You need to know what is the cost of information that can happen. So if you are not ready with the cost of information, if you are not ready to understand the situation altogether, this cannot work out for us. So this is why we need to understand information will have a deeper impact on the disaster. Now, the threat of life. Now, people say that what is the cost of life? Could you estimate the cost of life? People say that a cost of life might be 5 lakhs, 10 lakhs, 20 lakhs, or can I just put it in a simple way, the cost of life is priceless. The reason being is that many a times when you have seen when an accident happens or any kind of disaster that happens in our country, the one thing that government prominently does is that they announce a price tag for every single life that is lost. let's say if any one of the incidents that had happened and somebody died in an accident, somebody got killed because of some incident, somebody got affected by anything, the government immediately announces a package. The government immediately says that I will pay you 2 lakhs or 5 lakhs or 6 lakhs for the loss of a single life. But then let's go back and try to understand, is life only valuable so much? Is life only worth that 1 or 2 lakhs? Is life only worth that single moment altogether? No, life is definitely not worth 1 or 2 lakhs. It is priceless. The cost of living on this earth is priceless. You have got only one life and you need to live it. You have the rights to live it. But unfortunately, please understand, in case of disaster management, the threat for life is very, very high. And when it happens, what is the assurance? What is the guarantee that a government or any other factor can do to save the life? The answer is no for that, because most of the time government is not prepared, people are not ready, and people do not expect these kind of events to happen all along. So in the long run, what happens here is that the threat for the life continues through disaster management. So whenever an incident happens, let's say that even for an example here, the war that was waged because of terrorism in Iran, Iraq, Syria and all those places, Turkey and all those places, against the terrorism which happened a couple of years back, what happened altogether is that a fear was caused among the human system and people wanted to die because they felt that living in those kind of zones or living in those kind of countries itself is a very big threat or a punishment altogether. So any disaster that happens, the first impact is towards the common man's life. The common man feels that I have no other option other than dying, other than falling at the feet of that disaster. So somewhere down the lane, the caste, the creed, the factors of humanity and human mankind philosophies are one of the major things that will have an impact because of the disaster management. Now, moving forward, gender. Gender is a topic in our country which is very, very sensitive. So let me be very, very cautious in informing you about this topic, that I am not here to take the side of any gender. I am not here to talk about any gender or to motivate or promote any gender, but I am here to make you understand what is the impact of gender, what is the cause effect that happens because of a disaster platform. Now, when you look into women, children, widow, or anybody who is destitute or adolescent girls, they are the most vulnerable people to any kind of threats or health hazards. Why is that? Does it not affect a man? Yes, it does. But then the first impact is always to these people. The reason is quite simple. Most of the time, the people whom we are talking about on this slide, the women and children, are the people who stay back at home, are the people who are not much exposed to the outer world. So there are eventualities when any kind of attack happens on the building, on the house, or on the areas where they are living, they don't have an option to save their life. They do not even know what is happening outside their home. So sometimes when the attack comes in direct, now for example, there is a drone attack that happens, or there is a thunderstorm that hits, a lightning that hits, or a gas cylinder explosion that happens, the first person to get affected in that entire scenario would be a woman or a child. So the people who are inside the house are the first people who are the most vulnerable targets that we can ever talk about. So that is why I would say that the health hazard for a woman or for a child is even more when compared to a man who goes outside for work. So this is where the government needs to understand, or the necessary agencies need to understand, that women, children and those little girls need to be addressed, need to be trained, need to be taught how to handle during a scenario. Now, there have been many incidences which I can quote as an example in the case of a fire accident that has happened in several parts of India. The first people who had got affected were the women inside the house. But fortunately, the women knew how to close that fire, how to douse that fire altogether, so they were able to escape out of the scenario. By the time the men in that society came running around the house trying to protect them, the fire had already engulfed the entire thing. But fortunate enough, 2 or 3 of the women already ran out and they tried to help them out altogether. But then this scenario might not be applicable everywhere in India. But the fact remains that the most vulnerable people in any society, in any village, in any town, in any city will definitely be women and children only. Followed by young women. Adolescent young widows are also abused to sexual violence that happens because of a disaster. Now let's talk about for a moment in Syria and in Iraq what had happened because of terrorism impact that we were talking about even in the previous slides altogether. Now this is quite a sensitive information which I am sharing across to you. So I would respect and regard everybody in this matter that when we are talking about this topic, this is something which is very, very heart-melting incident. This is very, very important for all of us to pay attention and listen. When we are talking about a dreaded terrorist group called as the ISIS, which tried to molestate the women, which really tried to go against the women, which really tried to exploit them in all the way possible, that was a sheer disaster on this earth. That happened because those people tried to go ahead and they literally destroyed the life of people living in those areas, especially in Iraq, Syria, Turkey and all those regions. Why did that happen? Because of a war that was created by them. In the war, most of these young women and children were left completely isolated. They didn't have place to go anywhere. The terrorists took them as soft targets. They exploited them to the maximum level possible. Many of the women and children were even killed in that incident. Now look at the situation altogether. Fortunate enough that this incident did not happen in our country. But yes, this incident was happening in some corner of the globe. We were not in a position to save them. So this is where we need to understand the impact of a disaster. When we speak about all good things in the world, when we speak about all positive things in the world, we also need to know then bad things impacts altogether. This becomes a very, very important scenario. This becomes a very, very important factor altogether. Now, similarly, when we are talking about elderly persons, both men and women, they are all neglected out of the group in all respect, in all aspect altogether. So you see that this women, these people have been neglected. They have been thrown away in terms of the disaster management. They have not been given an option. They have not been given an ideology how to protect them, how to save them when a disaster happened. Similarly, why? Because when you talk about these elderly person, let's talk about the current pandemic situation itself. It was very, very evident that when the coronavirus or the COVID-19 struck for the old people, probably they did not have any other option in terms of leaving them rather than trying to save them. Most of the people who were affected were in the age category of 50 to 60 or 60 to 70 years, and they did not have an option to save themselves. Rather, they completely circumstanced themselves to the defeat, to the philosophy altogether. And that was very, very important in terms of understanding. Now, when we talk about the age factor, the age is a very, very important factor here. What can age have a relationship with the disaster altogether? That's what people try to question, or that's what people try to ask. But let's try to understand. The youngest and the oldest people are the most impacted in the destructive manner. Why? Both of them are physically weak. Both of them are mentally not ready for any surprises. So that is where disaster takes an advantage altogether. When a disaster strikes, let's say a lightning strikes a building or a tsunami comes out of the beach and hits the city altogether, when a flash flood happens, an old man will not be able to run at the same speed or jump over a compound wall as that of a young man. The similar thing, a 2-year-old or a 3-year-old kid will not be able to do with the same physical ability as that of a matured young man. So what happens here is that the disaster, when it happens, it takes the oldest and the youngest as the two easy soft targets. They just come and they just take them away. And at the end of the day, when you and me read about the disaster that has happened in the newspaper, we are just left helpless. We are just left clueless. We do not know what is happening. We do not know what is the factor altogether. And we just keep crying in terms of finding out a solution for this kind of situation. So it is highly important that each one of us spend time in terms of understanding what is disaster management. When we come to location, is location so important in terms of disaster management? The answer is yes. Why? Because not all the locations in the world are secure, neither all the locations are prone to disaster. But then it has its own natural effect altogether. So when you are going to live along the coastal areas, when you are going to live along the areas of the river embankment or the sea coast, you are directly prone to the rippling effects of natural disaster that is going to affect. Now, there are a lot of places that are prone to ethnic or communal violence also. Why? Because there are many locations in India, because of communal problem, because of problem that has been caused between people. There has been reasons why those innocent people get affected in a disaster management altogether. More places are prone to earthquake also. In India, several parts of our country are prone to earthquake because of the seismic factors. So location does play an important role in terms of disaster management. When you look into the map of India, you will feel that people living in the central parts of India are more secured when compared to the people living on the coastlines of the country. The reason is that because the coastline is directly affected by all kinds of attack, whereas the central part of India is not affected much other than the earthquake altogether. So it becomes highly important for all of us to understand that people living towards the coastline might be not just prone to tsunami, but they are also prone to cyclone, thunderstorm, or any kind of flash floods which might affect them. So location is one of the key factors in disaster management which has to be understood and which has to be carefully dealt with. Moving forward, we will also be talking about the disabilities that have been happening altogether. So we are going to talk about the visually challenged, hearing impaired, the physically disabled people, mentally challenged people, unable to hear the signals, difficulty in terms of evacuation, their difficulty in terms of getting access relief for the compensation money, and difficulty in the avenues of escape. Definitely, when we talk about a normal human being who's not able to protect himself at any given point of time, look at those people who are specially able, yes, but they are not able to move themselves. They are not able to physically free themselves from the situation. So automatically these people are even more affected because of the disaster management. They are not able to get the signals properly. They are not able to get the compensation. They are not able to understand the scenario. So it becomes even more difficult for the government to come to that scenario levels and save people and take it forward. So it is highly important for each one of us to understand and go forward in terms of managing the disaster. Now, moving forward, with this, we come to the conclusion of this session. I hope and believe that this session was highly informative, useful, and also important in terms of understanding the disaster management. What we will try to do in the next session is we will try to understand the disaster management at a global level, at a bigger level altogether, and try to assess the different factors that are governing. Until then, please stay tuned, stay blessed, and stay enlightened forever. Thank you once again for joining me on today's session.